Good morning. My name is Ruth Yvonne Benson Idahosa. I'm the founder and executive director of Pathfinders Justice Initiative, an NGO working to combat sex trafficking here in Benin City, Edo State, Nigeria. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you today on behalf of both Pathfinders and Clean Foundation, with whom we partnered to be able to conduct this research. So I welcome you to our public dissemination meeting on the research findings on our research on recruiters of sex trafficking in Oriedo local government area here in Benin City, Edo State. We were able to conduct this research with support from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, formerly DFID, as well as UKAID. And so we're grateful to our supporters. So I wanted to start with just giving you an outline of our agenda for today. First, we will start by discussing the goals for this particular meeting. We will recap our project objectives and then move into some details about the research methodology, before then moving into our findings, our conclusions, our recommendations, following which there will be a Q&A session, and we're hoping to get some inputs and feedback from you at that point in time. We will then discuss any upcoming events before we close for today. All right, so as far as our goals for this particular meeting, the first is to really develop a shared understanding of the findings of this research, which focused on recruiters of sex trafficking in Oriedo local government area. We hope to be able to receive as much input as we can from you, the stakeholders, on the specific research findings and our recommendations on how you think that they can actually be operationalized. How can we transform what we have into real programs, real interventions that can be effective in the community? And then the third was to generate your input on best practices, on recommendations. If there are people that you think might need to be to have access to this report, please share that information with us, and then further sources of evidence regarding policy recommendations. All right, so let's start with just a recap of our project objectives. We actually started off with three aspects in mind. The first was to empower and slave-proof local communities by deterring the recruitment of potential victims for sex trafficking by enablers. And you will notice that as we go through the today, you'll see in the research report that we're honored to be able to share with you that the term recruiters and enablers were used interchangeably. And so anytime you see recruiters or you see enablers, just know that we're referring to the same group of people. And so our first objective was to really empower and slave-proof communities against these recruiters or enablers. The second objective was to inform prevention strategies and programs through effective community-informed interventions. And the third was to contribute to the overall growing database of data-driven research, right, that will inform policies and programs and help us really scale the sort of interventions that we've been able to come up with. And so just to give you a recap of this particular subject, some of you may remember we started with a methodology workshop back in August of 2019, and at that point we brought stakeholders together to really share with you some of our hypotheses, what we were thinking about this particular subject of looking into recruiters of sex trafficking from Oriedo local government area. And at that time, we conducted a desk review. We were looking for any research that was out there that focused solely on recruiters of sex trafficking, and we're not really able to come up with anything, but we thought this was so important because recruiters are a critical part of the trafficking chain. They're really the middleman that really joins, that connects, I should say, the potential victim to the trafficker. And so our hypothesis was that because they are critical, because they're the initiating actors, that they really serve as this link. And we hypothesized that if we could break that link between the potential victim and the recruiter, we could actually see an overall reduction of trafficking from Edo State. And so as far as our research methodology was concerned, I think, first of all, it's so important that that we're bringing you this information at a very, very critical time, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, because what we're hearing from returnees on the ground as a grassroots organization is that because of how difficult the COVID-19 lockdown was for them, because they they suffered a lot. They didn't have the same kind of cushion that you and I might have had economically, that there is going to be this influx of returnees and potential survivors that are leaving, Nigeria, and really, taking that trek back, that horrific experience back towards Libya. And so it's important that as stakeholders, we actually are sharing this information and coming up with interventions on things that we can actually do now to prevent that mass exodus that we are hearing could potentially happen once all the borders reopen. And so what we did as far as the research methodology was combine a qualitative and quantitative methodology to really take a deeper dive into this subject and the activities and the roles of enablers in the community. And so the reason why we did that was so that we could elicit really critical information that could be turned into data to inform policy engagements, as I mentioned. We selected Ooredoo because unfortunately, Ooredoo has developed the reputation globally, infamously, as one of the biggest hubs of sex trafficking, particularly the biggest in Africa. And so what we did was really we administered 3,600 surveys to a cross-section of the population in Ooredoo. We were able to conduct 24 key informant interviews, as well as 6 focus group discussions. And so many of you that are here today were actually a part of these focus group discussions. You gave us your time to be able to conduct the key informant interviews, and so we're grateful. That again was, we spoke to youth, we spoke to different CSOs. There was a cross-section of different government agencies, ministries, NAPTIP from the Edo State Task Force, but it was also critical for us that we speak to survivors of sex trafficking, and also to speak to former recruiters as well, to be able to make sure that we had a full breadth of all the potential sources that would inform our research. So in addition to the primary sources and the micro-level research approach to extract qualitative and quantitative data, what we also did was conduct a desk review and looked at different articles and journals in media and organizational reports, so that we had all the information out there. We also looked at some of the interventions that had been conducted by different organizations outside the context of Nigeria, to see if there's anything that we could actually pull to adopt here in Edo State in connection with the subject of trafficking. And so essentially what we did was put the information, as you will see in the report today, into 3 large buckets. The first was an awareness and understanding. The second was demographics and the profile of what these enablers or recruiters look like. And then the third was perceptions of interventions in Ooredoo local government area. And so when it comes to the subject of awareness in sex trafficking, what we found that awareness was actually very high, and trafficking is obviously prevalent in this particular community. 99.3% of the people that we surveyed were aware of the general and had a general understanding of what sex trafficking was. 92.3% of them understood that trafficking was a crime, and 60.1% indicated that they were aware of the penalties of trafficking in Edo State. When we questioned them about where they were getting their information from as far as sex trafficking was concerned, the majority of people told us that they got their information from television and radio, from friends, word of mouth, social media, and then their schools. Those were the top 5 sources of information for respondents. Interestingly, nearly 1 in 4 respondents, about 23% of them, actually know of someone who had been sex trafficked, which is actually very fascinating, or was very fascinating to us, because we had come across some reports that said 1 in 3 young women in Edo State had actually been recruited into sex trafficking. So it was interesting that to a certain extent, that particular statistic correlates with our finding here, that nearly 1 in 4 actually know somebody who had been trafficked. And so it's clear that the recruitment process is actually leading to trafficking. But 43.2% actually said that they did not know, they did not know who they could inform if they had information about trafficking. So that was obviously very interesting as well. So in light of the fact that there was some general knowledge about it, 43.2% of the people did not know who to inform with that knowledge. As far as push factors were concerned, as we're all very common with, the top push factors that we heard from respondents was poverty, ignorance, family pressure, a status symbol, the general insecurity, and the poor infrastructure of Nigeria. And so it was interesting too that many of the people that we surveyed were actually very aware of the players in the trafficking networks, right? So many of them were able to inform us of some of these names. So in Nigeria, we hear the term, bogas or trolleys, connection man. In Mali, they had different terms there like gid and tuaret and bet. And in destination countries, they had madams and ogas, boss or sponsor as well. So this was interesting because when we came to the actual profiling of the recruiter, for us at Pathfinders, we've come up with a vulnerability criteria, right, for the actual potential victim. We know what the potential victim will look like. Because we came up in light of our anecdotal research with a 12-point criteria. So we know that generally a woman who is potentially vulnerable to trafficking is anywhere between 15 and 25. We know that she's usually from a single parent home. She's not very well educated. And so these were 12 things that actually helped us to create a profile for the potential victim. But when it came to the subject of enablers, we really couldn't actually create the same kind of physical profile because enablers were so different. They were mothers, they were husbands, they were, pastors from churches, they were imams. And, it was just such a cross section of potential of people that what we ended up doing actually was looking at the tactics, the way that they recruit, and created a profile based on that. And so what we found that most recruiters are actually older than the person that they're recruiting, right? Between the ages of 36 and 45 years old. 73% of them were women as well. So when it comes to the tactics of recruiters, it's interesting that recruiters, the research showed us that recruiters are really someone that most of these people know. So it's not this stranger that's coming from a different area. These are people that are known within the community as well. 63.5% of our respondents indicated that it was someone that they knew, and only 25% of them indicated that these recruiters were actually strangers. The two main categories that we were able to break up the data as far as recruiters were concerned was digital enablers and physical enablers. So digital enablers are people who are now recruiting on various online platforms, with Facebook and WhatsApp being the most popular. And the physical enabler, I think, is who we generally would think of an in-person recruiter. And so when it comes to the kinds of physical recruiters, what the data showed us was that they were broken up into two separate categories. One was the helper recruiter, which is generally unpaid and may not even be aware of the full implications of what their actions are initiating. The second was a professional recruiter, which is a paid recruiter, and the kind that we would generally think of in our mind when it comes to recruiting from Edo State. And so we came across 5 categories of professional recruiters. The first were these Pure boys, which were young men who are married to traffickers that are based in Libya or in Europe. And they travel regularly, come back to Benin to actually conduct recruiting. The second category, these bogas or connection man, right? They specialize in the Libya, Morocco routes. The third category was voodoo priests, juju priests, and pastors, which actually made up a significant amount to be able to create their own categories, right? We then had scouters, local recruiters who conduct on-the-ground assessment of the potential victims before then connecting them to the traffickers. And then the last group that we were able to come up with based on the research was former trafficking victims. All right, so when it comes to the motivations of recruiters, why are people actually recruiting for sex trafficking in Oreado local government area? 72% of the respondents overwhelmingly believe that recruiters, that the primary reason was a need for money, as opposed to coercion or social pressure or something else. And so this was consistent, I think, with what we knew anecdotally, that most people who are actually recruiting in those states are doing that because of money. As far as payments were concerned, the question that we asked the respondents was, how much do you think recruiters are actually getting paid? 46% of them estimated that recruiters are being paid between 200,000 and 400,000 naira per victim, right? Although, as far as the range was concerned, we had some respondents that told us they think that recruiters are making anywhere from 50,000 naira all the way to 4 million naira. And so that was actually very interesting, because we know that on average, each successfully recruited a woman is able to earn up to $100,000 for her trafficker every year. All right, so when it comes to the tactics that recruiters use, right, the overwhelming response that we got, as far as 61% of the surveyed population, was that recruiters are actually using promises of fortune and a better life, right? So that really is the number one way that recruiters are approaching their potential victim, with promises of financial aspiration. So it's never really a situation where you see someone threatening somebody to travel, or somebody kidnapping someone to travel, as far as when it comes to young women. The second area that we were able to understand was that a lot of them, 26% always reference a large amount of money, i.e. that the potential victim will be able to earn a large amount of money. 7.1% of them reassured safety. 2.9% mentioned a known connection man or community person to put the potential victim at ease, and only 1.6% of them actually use threats, and less than 1% social shaming. Now, when it comes to the schemes that recruiters actually use, what was interesting was that we found that recruiters will actually conduct a sort of due diligence. They will conduct a background search on the potential victim. So meaning that they will ask questions to her neighbors, inquire about what her interests are, inquire about the things that they know will potentially increase the chances of them successfully recruiting this young woman. They usually also demand secrecy. So they tell the young woman, don't say anything to somebody that's going to spoil your opportunity, right? So they're demanding secrecy from their potential victims. They are building a relationship of trust and legitimacy, right? So they spend the time, to ensure that they're doing whatever they can to gain the trust of the potential victim. They're also offering, free help. So they know that the potential victim, needs maybe money to pay for malaria drugs or something like that. They will offer that to the potential victim as well. They will offer guidance to her as well. All of this is an effort to really have her lower her guard, right? And then, it was interesting that some of the respondents referred to a customized package, right? So they recruiters are doing such a good job at targeting a potential victim based on what her aspirations are. So if you have a young woman who is interested in being a model, then the package that they will offer to get this woman to agree to be trafficked overseas is that she will then have a modeling career in somewhere in Europe, right? So they're also, some of them are highlighting the victims' appearances, they are complimenting them about how they look. All of this, again, just to lower the young woman's guard. And then finally, we've come to understand that they then formalize these agreements, right? Either with a written contract that is actually signed by the young woman, or actually taking her to a juju priest to have her swear an oath. Now, when it comes to the target victims of recruiters in Edo State, we noticed that they are actually targeting, as many of us know who are focused on this work, that they target the poor and the most vulnerable. They're also targeting people who are illiterate or psychologically weak, naive or ignorant, not really exposed to urban life. And the third target that we found was mothers, because they know that if you're able to, it was easier, I should say, to convince a mother to release her daughter than to try to convince a father. Now, when it comes to the conditions that allow for recruiting in Edo State, that allow for the proliferation of recruiting in Edo State, what we found was that one of the explanations that we got from respondents was that that trafficking was happening because of how complex immigration regulations are and fees are to be able to try to go the legal way. Right. So if you wanted to go to a visa, wanted to get a visa to get into these countries, the fact that the process was so complex, was so difficult, became prohibitive, right, for many of the people who were actually trying to do it the legal way. Another thing that we found was complicity from the community, a tolerance to a certain extent of trafficking in Edo State. There was also endemic recruiting locations. So there were parts of Edo State, parts of Oredo local government area that actually were more endemic than other areas. So we've heard of the Upper Sakwamba, for example. And then the fourth condition that allows for the proliferation of trafficking is this is online recruiting, and because it's so easy, you're able to actually scale the number of targets that you potentially have when you're recruiting online. The next thing we looked at were the perceptions of the community on the current interventions that are happening, right? So the current programs, the current organizations that are working on the issues of trafficking in Edo State. And one of the most interesting facts that came out of the data was that although most people had a general idea on what trafficking looks like, on what sex trafficking looks like, 85.6% of them were unaware of any effective programs that would prevent sex trafficking in Edo State. And so you have people who have a general idea of what sex trafficking is, but they don't know how to get support so that sex trafficking does not become their only option, right? So in Edo State, 43.9% of the respondents believe that there were no persons or entities in the state that were specialized in the fight against sex trafficking and the protection of survivors. 19.4% of them indicated that they did not know. 52.9% indicated that they did not know if Edo had a comprehensive state policy or action plan to combat sex trafficking. And so I think as stakeholders, this is very eye-opening for us, because I think we think that we are doing a good job raising awareness. But I think where the disconnect is that even though the community is actually aware of what sex trafficking is, there's a disconnect because they don't know how to then get support to be able to find an alternative. Now, when it comes to the perceptions of the interventions, we actually provided our survey respondents, as well as people in the key informants interviews and focus groups, with several organizations or agencies, NDAs, that are working on the subject of human trafficking. And it was interesting that on a federal level, people from Oredo had more confidence in those agencies or MDAs than they did on a local level. So you can see, I'll just point out one or two examples. The Nigeria Police Force, for example, a lot of people felt that it was ineffective. Only 33% felt that it was effective. When you look at NAPTIP, for example, 47% of the respondents felt that NAPTIP was actually quite effective. One of the groups that I think was most effective, at least from the respondents' points of view, was the State Ministry of Women Affairs. All right, so when we asked what programs would be most effective in their communities, right, the top 5 responses were job opportunity programs. And this is to combat sex trafficking. The first was job opportunities. People felt like they needed more jobs. They needed to be aware of more job opportunities. Second, they felt that awareness needed to also be increased, but not just the general awareness of what sex trafficking is, but they wanted to be educated and made aware of the potential dangers and risks of being trafficked. The third was effective policing. So they wanted more effective law enforcement, and they wanted an increase in the number of arrests. The fourth was prosecution. So the respondents were telling us that people need to be prosecuted, and they don't actually see enough of traffickers or recruiters actually getting recruited, and they wanted more of that. The fifth was training opportunities. Again, education to increase their awareness of where training opportunities are in Edo State. When we asked the respondents who or which groups should be targeted to prevent sex trafficking, the #1 response that we got was parents. So it's not the potential victim, it's not the potential recruiter, it is parents. Overall, 2,420 respondents indicated that parents were the #1 target group in an effort to actually prevent sex trafficking. Next, the next response that we got was for youth programs, and then schools, religious organizations, social clubs, associations, market owners, and then there was a group of 187 that referred to several other programs. But again, the top target that the community was saying to us that needed to be tackled, that needed to be targeted to prevent sex trafficking, was actually parents. And I don't think that should come as a surprise to many of us who are doing this work in Edo State. And so when it comes to the conclusions of our findings, the first thing, as I mentioned, was that awareness is high and recruiting in Oreado is actually quite pervasive. The respondents and the community was very conversant on the terminology, on the routes, and they also were aware of the recruiter mechanisms, the schemes, the tactics, the modus operandi that I referred to earlier. And there was also a lack of education. So the fact that they were generally aware of sex trafficking did not equate to their knowledge on where to get support to counter that. There was also this comparison poverty, which I found very interesting, because I think a lot of times when we talk about sex trafficking, when you see sex trafficking researched, a lot of people will say, well, Edo is not the poorest state in the country. They're not the least educated in the country. So how can poverty be a reason why there's so much trafficking from this particular area? And I think what this data revealed for us was that Edos don't compare themselves to a scientific definition of trafficking. They're not really, sorry, of poverty. They're not looking at, the World Bank definition where, as long as you're living below, you're earning, living on $1.9 every single day, then you're living in abject poverty. That's not what they're looking at, nor are they comparing their level of poverty to what's happening, say, in the northeast of Nigeria, where Boko Haram is prevalent. What was interesting is that Edo people, Oreado people, I should say, not Edo, Oreado people are actually comparing their level of poverty to someone that they know that is now living abroad. And so that's why they can say, I'm poor, because they look at somebody that they knew in their local community, and that person has now traveled overseas, and the comparison is made to that particular person, so not to scientific information or data. Another thing that was very clear to us was that the community was saying, look, if you are designing interventions, if you are coming up with strategies to prevent trafficking, if it is for us, it should be by us, right? So our voices should inform the interventions that you're creating to fight trafficking. Another conclusion that we made was that enablers are entrenched and critical initiators who operate with the same modus operandi. So as I said earlier, they may not necessarily have a physical profile, but as far as their tactics are concerned, as far as their schemes, their modus operandi are concerned, there's a lot of similarity. And so it was around that we were able to frame our profile. The next thing was that breaking the link is crucial and possible. So that link that I mentioned earlier between the potential victim and the trafficker, it's actually possible, it's crucial and possible to be able to break that link. And so when it comes to our recommendations in our report, what we did was combine the information that we got from the community itself with some of the things that we thought were actually also very important to the anti-trafficking movement. And so I think the first thing that we recommended was really invest in gathering a local community input. Right? These interventions must be community informed. And the reason why that has to be the case is because that really is the only way that the community can take ownership and accountability, and the intervention can then become sustainable. Right? Another thing was to influence the influencers. And a perfect example of this was the Oba of Benin's pronouncement in March of 2018, when he pronounced and put a curse on traffickers of young women in Benin, in Edo State. And I think the reason why it became so significant was that that didn't just happen overnight, right? This took years and meetings from NAPTIP and Governor Obaseki and Edo State Task Force, people who actually continued to request that the Oba involve himself in this particular issue. And so that's what we mean by influence the influencers. That is what we're saying. Find the people within the community who have a voice and inform them, train them so that they can actually become a way to amplify anti-trafficking messaging. The next recommendation was that the absence of coordination between the stakeholders is actually a gap that is being exploited, and that has to be closed, right? So we have many organizations that are working on this particular subject. And a general example I will give is that you can have a group of one organization go to Adesuwa Girls Grammar School on Monday. On Friday there will be another organization that comes to that same school. And meanwhile you have lots of other areas within the community that are not getting any information whatsoever. And so there needs to be this coordinated effort between governments, between CSOs, so that we're all actually informing the community in a way that's unified and also speaking with the same voice, with the same messaging. The next recommendation was to innovate with technology. And what this data actually showed us was that traffickers have long moved on, even before COVID-19, they've long moved on online. And that's where a lot of the recruiting is actually happening. Another thing we found, and as a result of the data, and therefore a recommendation, was that reporting traffickers is actually a challenge. We have to make it easier. Most of the people that we surveyed said, even if they became aware of somebody who was being trafficked, they either wouldn't know who to report the issue to, or they didn't necessarily know how to make a report. And so it was important to us that we make that recommendation to all the stakeholders, that we need to create some sort of a reporting mechanism where people are no longer afraid to report because of the implications of that. So whether it's an anonymous hotline or something to that effect, it's important that we actually create that. The next recommendation was that legislation alone cannot mitigate vulnerability to trafficking, right? So we actually have to address what is creating that vulnerability, particularly when it comes to gender disparities, when it comes to women. And so it's important that we actually come up with solutions that address the root causes of the trafficking, and not just try to legislate in an effort to see if that will work. Obviously, we need to broaden our perspective and start to address the vulnerabilities themselves. Stakeholders must actually address the mindset that deems prostitution a viable alternative to poverty. As a Benin woman, as an Edo woman myself, it's unfortunate, that I see many of the young survivors that we work with actually consider, when they're telling us their stories, indicate to us that in their minds, prostitution was an alternative, because they grew up. Most of these young women who are now in their late teens or early 20s, they grew up understanding the concept of sex trafficking. They grew up with mothers who maybe had been grooming them from childhood to travel abroad. And so it wasn't surprising, right? So that they framed their mindset now to be able to accept prostitution as an alternative to poverty. And so one of our recommendations was that stakeholders actually address that particular aspect of it. The next thing was that, we really need to abandon this, don't travel messaging, because I mean, I think most of the time we see this from international donors that think, oh, if people only knew how bad Libya was, they wouldn't leave Edo states, they wouldn't leave Nigeria. But that messaging is actually not working, and that's what the community was saying to us. That if you give that message, it has to be coupled hand in hand with an alternative. You have to be able to say, okay, don't travel. Here's the data. Here's the reason why you shouldn't travel, but here's a reason to stay in Nigeria. Here is a viable opportunity, an economic opportunity for you. So those things have to go hand in hand. If you just have one without the other, it's not going to be effective. Another thing that we found is that some of the same preventative measures that we target potential victims with could also be effective on the helper enablers, right? So it was interesting that the root causes of recruiting in Edo states, the primary two root causes were poverty and ignorance. And it was also interesting that on the push factors, we also saw push factors for why young women are vulnerable to becoming trafficked. We also saw poverty and ignorance. And so it's possible that the interventions that we use to target potential victims could also potentially be effective on helper enablers as well, because they are both dealing with two of the same issues. All right, the next thing was that there needs to be more innovative alternatives forms of employment. We need to increase the trainings that we're currently doing for stakeholders, particularly for houses of worship and for law enforcement, because there is a distrust between the community and law enforcement. But I think all of us probably already knew that, but we do need to continue steadily increasing the trainings that we're providing for these stakeholders. It's important that we establish a formal witness protection program. And the reason why we have to do that is because the people who we need as witnesses to be able to increase the number of prosecutions that we have, either through the task force or through NAPTIP, are the survivors, are the victims of trafficking. And so in order to be able to protect these young women who are afraid for their lives, who are being threatened by the recruiters or the recruiters' connections, it's important that we actually establish a formal witness protection program. And then, as I mentioned earlier, one of our recommendations is to create this toll-free anonymous reporting helpline that will simultaneously link the potential victims to CSOs, in addition to allow them to report recruiting. So that's important because what it will do is give the young woman an opportunity to report a recruiter, but also simultaneously get information on how she can actually get support as well. And so what we're doing as a result to address our #1 objective that I mentioned earlier is that we're launching our pilot today, as a matter of fact. So that pilot is referred to as Each One, Reach One. And so the idea of that was to connect a potential victim with a survivor and someone who has already gone through the experience. And so what we're trying to do, what we're intending to do is to bring these groups together and train the survivor to become an ambassador against recruiting. She will then become my sister's keeper, making sure that that young potential victim is not a target for recruiters, checking up on her. And we're gonna ask survivors to share their experience, right, with the potential victims. Following that particular training, the pairs will be tracked for 6 months to ensure that the survivor is continuing to mentor the potential victim. She's informing her of resources, she's informing her of opportunities, making sure that she's actually she's getting all the information that she needs as well to ensure that she is slavery proof. And so we're launching that today and really, really excited to be able to start that pilot. We're calling it, like I said, Each One, Reach One. All right. So finally, there are many areas of additional research that are needed, and these are all outlined in your report. So I will just point to a few of them. As I mentioned, one of the things that we need to do is address that mindset. So it would be useful to potentially get additional research on that particular subject. I think it's also important that we make a comparison of the recruiting in Ooredoo and look at areas in Edo where recruiting is not prevalent, where recruiters are not gaining easy access to young women. For example, in Edo North, right? We know that the prevalence of recruiting there is considerably lower than in Ooredoo. Why is that? It's important that maybe we conduct some research to look at the features of that community, to look at the postures of that community. What are the cultures that are preventing the proliferation of trafficking in those areas? And what can we learn from them? Can we then adapt and adopt some of those things in Ooredoo local government area so that we can then reduce the incidence of trafficking here? It's also important that we are expanding the research on the subject of recruiters outside of Ooredoo to compare what the modus operandi are, to compare what the demographics are as well. Another key point that I wanted to highlight was just the cost of preventing recruiting versus victim rehabilitation. It would be interesting to see how much the comparison of the incidence of online trafficking versus in-person recruiting. It would also be interesting if we could get some research on the impact of the Oba of Benin's March 2018 pronouncement. Did it have an impact? I mean, I think anecdotally from the stories that we're hearing, there certainly was a considerable impact. But can we can we actually create data to support that? And then last but not least, the impact of COVID-19 on recruiting from Edo State. So at this point, we're going to open it up to the floor to be able to get some questions and answers from you, to get some feedback from you, to get your input on recruiting, and to hear, really hear what you have to say. Did all this information confirm your thoughts on recruiting? Was there anything that you found to be particularly interesting? Are there any organizations that you feel should receive our report? So please let us know. I want to again thank you on behalf of Clean Foundation and Pathfinders Justice Initiative for taking your time to join me today on this very important and timely subject. Thank you.